Hello, and welcome to True Crime Sleep Stories, where you can settle in with a good true crime tale while drifting off into a safe, sleepy slumber. Maybe you want to sip on a cup of hot tea, grab a warm blanket, or cozy up by the fire. Whatever you decide to do, just make sure you're comfortable and ready for relaxation. I'm your host, Kelly Behrens-Brink, and before we get started tonight, I want to remind you that as a Patreon member, you'll get even more sinister, sleepy content because you get multiple versions of each and every true crime sleep story. Patrons will have access to an ad-free version so you can really relax without the distraction of advertisements. You'll get both audio and video versions as well. There's a lot of value in your Patreon membership, and best of all, you're supporting the show. You can go to patreon.com/truecrimesleepstories to get started. And now it's time to get comfy because I'm going to tell you a bedtime story. In 1912, in Villisca, Iowa, the Moore family was considered affluent in their small community, and they were very well liked. Josiah, age 43, was married to Sarah, 39, and together they had a beautiful, happy family with their 4 children, Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur Boyd, 7, and the youngest, Paul Vernon, just 5 years old. On the evening of June 9th, 1912, the Moore family was attending a fun Children's Day program at their church, and this was a big deal in their town. Sarah was very involved with their church, and she had helped organize this event. Lots of people were going to be there, including their good friends, the Stillinger family. 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and 8-year-old Ina Stillinger were good friends with the only Moore daughter, 10-year-old Mary Catherine, who went by her middle name, just Catherine. The church event wasn't scheduled to end until about 10 p.m. that evening, and the little Stillinger girls were apprehensive to walk in the dark the 2 miles they'd needed to trek home. The walk home would have been especially dark for the little girls on this particular night because the electric company and the Villisca Town Council were in the midst of a dispute about lighting. So the electric company shut off all the lights in the town, coincidentally on this particular day, making the town extra dark. The Moores arranged sleepover plans with the Stillingers, and Lena and Ina accompanied the family of 6 to their East 2nd Street home after church services ended. I can imagine how delighted the 6 young children would have been after a festive church event organized especially for kids, and with the added excitement of having friends sleeping over. Their small farmhouse would most likely be bustling with activity, laughter, and joy, which makes what happened in the overnight hours all the more heartbreaking. Bedtime would have come a little later than usual this evening, with not arriving home until around 10 p.m. and having guests, so we can assume that all the kiddos were tucked in and sleeping by around 11 p.m., with JB and Sarah right behind them. Lena and Ina Stillinger slept downstairs in the main floor guest bedroom. Up the steep staircase and just to the left was JB and Sarah's bedroom. Just past that was the bedroom that the 4 Moore children shared. In between the 2 bedrooms was a small door that led into an attic storage space, and this is where it's thought that someone may have been waiting, hiding, and lurking until everyone in the house was fast asleep. The murders are thought to have happened sometime after midnight through the early morning hours. Doctors estimate the time of death as somewhere shortly after midnight. An unknown person entered the Moore's home, first killing JB and Sarah Moore. They were bludgeoned to death with an axe, leaving their faces unrecognizable. The the killer seemed to have managed to murder the adults without waking up the children. So it seems as though he worked very quickly and very quietly. He then walked into the next bedroom, murdering the 4 more children, the youngest just 5 years old. The killer may have thought his work was done now, and he went back after the Moors were dead to further desecrate their bodies, hitting them over and over again with the axe until their faces were basically gone. The furious axe swings left scrapes and indentations in the walls and ceilings which can still be seen in the house today. After brutally attacking this family, he went one by one and covered each person's head with clothing to cover their mutilated faces. And with the Moore family gone, the killer went downstairs to wash his hands in a bowl of water and have a snack. But what it seems as though he didn't know is that there were 2 young children still alive and sleeping on the main floor. But we'll get to that in just a moment. We first need to explore why we thought this killer was waiting in the attic for the family to go to sleep. First of all, there were cigarettes in the attic that someone had recently smoked. Nobody in the house was known to smoke. So we have to ask, was J.B. Moore a closet smoker who hid his habit from his wife, or was the killer smoking as he hid in wait? Here's why the killer in the attic story makes sense. The killer may have known that the Moores were at church until later in the evening. He could have entered the house through the usually unlocked door while everyone was gone and just stayed very quiet until later that night. Hiding in the attic until everyone went to sleep would make perfect sense. He would already be upstairs where he could then quietly creep out of the attic, kill the adults, and then the children. And had he done that, he wouldn't have known that Lena and Ina Stillinger were downstairs, still in the guest bedroom, sleeping. It's thought that he killed Lena and Ina last, and the reason why we think that is because this is where he left the bloody axe. It would make sense that the axe would be left in whatever room the final killings took place. So to recap so far, what we think is that the killer knew the Moores would be at church until later in the evening. He also knew that the town would be extra dark that night because the street lights were all out in town. This may or may not have affected the killer's decision to murder the family on that particular night, but it certainly wouldn't hurt a killer's plan to have it be a little darker than usual as they prowled through the night. The killer probably snuck into the house while the family was gone, waited in the attic smoking until the family was asleep. JB and Sarah Moore were probably killed first before killing the Moore children next. The killer was most likely taken by surprise finding 2 additional children in the house that he didn't expect to be there when he was walking downstairs getting ready to clean up. Lena Stillinger, age 12, and Ina Stillinger, age 8, should not have been in the Moore house on the evening of June 9th, 1912, and that's what makes this story all the more heartbreaking. Lena and Ina were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger. They had 7 sisters, and their mother was pregnant at the time of their death. Sadly, she would not only lose Lena and Ina, but also the baby she was carrying at the time of their deaths due to the immense stress that she endured. Lena and Ina are thought to be the final victims in the house. The killer first murdered the younger sister, Ina, and then struck the axe over Lena's head. However, it was determined that Lena woke up prior to dying. She had a defensive wound on her arm, indicating that she may have tried to fight off her attacker. Sadly, she wouldn't win that fight. Lena was found pulled partially down the bed, legs hanging off to the side. Her nightgown was pulled up to her chest, and she was not wearing any undergarments. Her legs were spread apart, and a kerosene lantern was still burning next to her body in the killer's effort to get a better look at the young girl. There was a blood smear inside Lena's right knee, and it's very likely she was sexually assaulted by her attacker either before or after her death. The sun would rise on Villisca, Iowa, the morning of June 10th over a town that would be forever changed. Neighbor Mary Peckham got up at the crack of dawn to hang laundry on the clothesline and found it immediately unusual to see no activity coming from the normally busy Moore house. Working on her own homestead, doing chores both inside and out, Mary would grow more and more puzzled as the clock ticked by that morning with no sign of the Moore family anywhere. By 8 a.m., Mary Peckham had a sinking feeling that something just wasn't right next door. She knocked on the door with no answer, so at that time she began doing a few essential things that the Moores would normally have done hours ago on a morning like this, such as tending to the chickens, feeding the animals, and things like that. As Mary Peckham was getting more and more worried, she even tried opening the doors to the Moore house, but they were all locked, and this put her over the top with worry. She rang for J.B. Moore's brother, Ross, telling him something was going on next door, but that she didn't know what. She asked him to come over and check on the family, and he did. Like Mary, he knocked, tried to open the door and all of that, but nothing. He finally started going through his key ring to see if maybe he had a key that could get him inside, and yes, he did. He unlocked the house and went inside alone while Mary stayed safe outside the door. The house was eerily still, quiet and dark. He immediately noticed that all of the curtains had been tightly drawn and covered with additional items of clothing to block out any light that could seep in, making the small house seem all the more stifling. Darkness and silence surrounded J.B. Moore's brother. When he opened the bedroom door, Ross saw 2 bodies on the bed and dark stains on the bedclothes. He returned immediately to the porch and told Mrs. Peckham to call the sheriff. The 2 bodies in the room downstairs were Lena and Ina Stillinger. The remaining members of the Moore family were found in the upstairs bedrooms by City Marshal Hank Horton, who arrived shortly on the scene. Every person in the house had been brutally murdered, and these findings would set into place one of the most mismanaged murder investigations ever to be undertaken. Once the murders were discovered, news traveled quickly in the small town. As neighbors and curious onlookers converged on the house, law enforcement officials quickly lost control of the crime scene. It's said that up to 100 people traipsed through the house gawking at the bodies before the Villisca National Guard finally arrived around noon to cordon off the area and secure the home. The only known facts of the crime scene were that 8 people had been bludgeoned to death, presumably with an axe left at the crime scene. It appeared all of them had been asleep at the time of the murders. Doctors estimated the time of death as somewhere shortly after midnight. Curtains were drawn on all of the windows in the house except 2 which didn't have curtains. Those windows were covered with clothing belonging to the Moores. All of the victims' faces were covered with bedclothes after they were killed. A kerosene lamp was found at the foot of the bed of Josiah and Sarah. A similar lamp was found at the foot of the bed of the Stillinger girls. The axe was also found in the Stillinger girls' room. It was bloody, but an attempt had been made to wipe it off. This axe belonged to Josiah Moore. An odd piece of keychain was found on the floor in the downstairs bedroom, and a pan of bloody water was discovered on the kitchen table, as well as a plate of uneaten food. All the doors were locked from the inside. Had these murders been committed today, it's almost certain that law enforcement officials would have easily solved the crime and brought the murderer to justice. Almost 100 years later, however, the Villisca axe murders still remain a mystery. The murderer or murderers would be dead by now, and their gruesome secret would be buried with them. While no one was ever convicted of the Villisca axe murders, there seemed to be no shortage of suspects. In the days following the crimes, you could have read about at least 4 possibilities in any edition of the newspaper. Many of the leads, however, were quickly exhausted, and as time wore on, they began to dwindle. Today, historians and those who have studied the axe murders extensively seem to be made up of 3 camps. There are many who believe Frank Jones, a prominent Villisca resident and Iowa state senator, was responsible for the brutal deaths of the Moores and the Stillinger children. Others adamantly insist that the crazed Reverend George Kelly was the culprit. Still others believe the Moore murders were the work of someone totally unrelated to the town of Villisca, a possible traveler or serial killer. People have many other suspects in mind for this case, but these were the 3 main ones. Frank Jones was a Villisca resident and an Iowa state senator. Josiah Moore had worked for Frank Jones at his implement store for many years before leaving to open his own store. Moore repeatedly took business away from Frank Jones, including a very successful John Deere dealership. And Josiah Moore was rumored to have had a sexual affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though no evidence supports this. Were these bad business dealings and a potential affair enough motive for murder? Many people think yes, but many people also think Reverend George Kelly was responsible for the murders. Kelly was an English-born traveling minister in town on the night of the murders. He was described as peculiar, reportedly having suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent. As an adult, he was accused of being a peeping Tom, and several times asking young women and girls to pose nude for him. On June 8, 1912, he came to Villisca to teach at the Children's Day services, which the Moore and Stillinger families attended on June 12, 1912. He left town between 5 a.m. and 5:50 a.m. on June 10, 1912, hours before the bodies were discovered. Reverend Kelly even confessed to the murders in court, but the jury didn't believe his confession. In the weeks following the murders, he displayed a fascination with the case and wrote many letters to the police, investigators, and family of the deceased. In 1917, Kelly was even arrested for the Villisca axe murders. Police obtained a confession from him. However, it followed many hours of intense interrogation, and later, Kelly recanted. After 2 separate trials, he was acquitted. And finally, in their 2017 book, The Man from the Train, Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James discuss the Villisca axe murders as part of a much larger series of murders which they believe were all committed by one single serial killer. They conclude that the murderer was Paul Mueller, an immigrant possibly from Germany who was the subject of an unsuccessful year-long manhunt as the sole suspect in the 1897 murder of a family in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, who had employed him as a farmhand. The co-authors of the book believe that Mueller was guilty of the Villisca axe murders, as well as a killing spree that lasted over a decade, killing at least 59 people in 14 separate incidents, including Colorado Springs and Paola. The Jameses identify common features to the crimes, many of which are also found at the Villisca scene. The killer selected families who lived near railroad tracks. He seemingly ambushed the victims at about midnight while they were asleep, used the blunt side of an axe rather than the blade to strike the victims in the head and face, used an axe that was found at their home, and left it in plain sight. He also covered all of his victims with blankets to prevent blood spatter. He covered windows from the inside of the house and locked doors before his departure. In Mueller's suspected crimes, there was often, but not always, a sexual motive directed towards a prepubescent girl, which would explain why Lena was partly disrobed. So who was responsible for the Villisca axe murders? To this day, we still don't know, but there was a strong possibility that a serial killer was actually at work. To this day, the location of the brutal 1912 murders is known simply as the Villisca Axe Murder House, and the walls still protect the identity of the murderer or murderers who bludgeoned to death the entire family and 2 overnight guests over 100 years ago. To many people, it seems as though the house is trying to speak to them. Visits by paranormal investigators have provided audio, video, and photographic proof of paranormal activity. Tours of the home have often been cut short by children's voices, falling lamps, moving ladders, and flying objects. Psychics have stated that there's a presence of spirits dwelling in the home, and many have claimed to communicate with them. Skeptics have come into the home and left believers. Who killed the victims of the Villisca axe murders? And is the house haunted? You can find out for yourself. Your belief may be the key that unlocks the door to the Villisca axe murder mystery, and you can even stay there overnight. For history buffs, the faint of heart, schools, clubs, or just curious people, the Villisca axe murder house is open for daytime tours. Or if you're really brave, you can rent the entire home for an overnight tour. I will be going for the 2nd year in a row with a group of podcasters to do just this. So stay tuned for our full report. I'm Kelly Behrens-Brink, and this has been tonight's True Crime Sleep Story. Good night, sleep tight, and don't let the monsters bite. Bye-bye. Hello and welcome to True Crime Sleep Stories, where you can settle in with a true crime tale while drifting off into a safe and sleepy slumber. Maybe you want to sip on a cup of hot tea, grab a warm fleece blanket, or cozy up by the fire. Whatever you decide to do, just make sure you're comfortable and ready for relaxation. I'm your host, Kelly Behrens-Brink, and before we get started tonight, I want to remind you that as a Patreon member, you'll get even more sinister, sleepy content because you get multiple versions of each and every true crime sleep story. Patrons will have access to an ad-free version so you can really relax without the distraction of advertisements, as well as a version with and without music. Some people really enjoy the music and some prefer it without, but patrons can have it both ways. You'll also receive a video version, so there's a lot of value there in your membership and you're supporting the show. You can go to patreon.com/truecrimesleepstories to sign up. And now it's time to get cozy because I'm going to tell you a bedtime story. "40-year-old Derek Broaddus and his wife Maria had everything to be thankful for and a future to be extremely excited about. Life seemed, well, perfect. Derek was the senior vice president of a big insurance company in Manhattan, and he was making a large salary. With 3 young children, this growing family decided now was the right time to purchase their dream home. Maria Broaddus had grown up in the well-to-do community of Westfield, New Jersey. The location, just 45 minutes from New York, but still with a safe, small-town vibe, made it perfect for young working families with children. It was rated as one of the safest and wealthiest towns in America. Within Westfield, the place to live was on the boulevard. It was a picturesque neighborhood lined with trees and grand historic homes, so when the gorgeous 6-bedroom, 4-bathroom home at 657 Boulevard, just blocks away from Maria's childhood home, went up for sale, the family decided it was time to buy, even with the hefty $1.4 million price tag. The home was within their budget and it had everything they wanted. That doesn't mean, though, that they didn't have a lot of renovations in mind to make their dream a reality. In fact, at first, Derek and Maria considered tearing the home down to rebuild from scratch. Ultimately, though, they decided renovating was a better plan, and that's what they did. Over the coming weeks, contractors would be in and out of what would be their new residence, updating and bringing the lovely home back to life. And just 3 days after they closed on the home, they were nearly ready to move in as Derek was finishing up some painting and a few other repairs. It was a little after 10 o'clock when he sat down his paintbrush for the night and got ready to head back to their previous residence, where they were still staying until their new home was done. But first, he walked out onto the front porch to check the mail. Since they weren't officially moved in yet, the box of mail was full of the usual junk mail that a family gets, like coupons and advertisements, but there was also an intriguing piece of personal mail addressed vaguely to the new owner in large, sloppy handwriting. The letter read,
Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. How did you end up here? Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its force within? 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out.
The letter made it apparent that even though the Broaddus family had not officially moved into their new home yet, there were eyes upon them, tracking their every move. This anonymous stalker knew intimate details of their lives, including information about their children who were 5, 8, and 10 years old. The letter went on.
I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. You have children. I have seen them. So far, I think there are 3 that I have counted. Are there more on the way? Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family, or was it greed to bring me your children? Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me. Who am I? Hundreds of cars pass by the house every single day. Maybe I am in one. Check all of the windows that can be seen from 657 Boulevard. Perhaps I am in one. Welcome, my friends. Welcome. Let the party begin. The Watcher.
This letter sent chills up Derek Broaddus's spine, and he immediately went into panic mode. When did this letter get delivered? Could this person still be on the property watching him? A nervous Derek called the police, and an officer quickly arrived on his doorstep. The officer on the scene reacted with fear and confusion when he read the words in the eerie letter. He also asked Derek if Derek or his family had any enemies, to which Derek responded that he couldn't think of anyone who would write such a letter. This police officer gave Derek Broaddus the usual advice to be careful, to keep the doors locked and call if they saw anything suspicious, and then he left. Who would send such ominous correspondence? Was this a serious threat or maybe just a really bad joke? Derek and Maria would compose an email to the previous homeowners that night to try to get more insight as to what was happening here. In the Broaddus' email to John and Andrea Woods, the couple who sold them 657 Boulevard, they asked them if they had any idea who the watcher might be or why the author had written the specific line saying, "I asked the Woods to bring young blood, and it looks like they listened." Andrea Woods replied the next morning stating that just a few days before moving out of 657 Boulevard, John and Andrea Woods also received a letter from the Watcher. Andrea described the note as odd. The letter to the Woods family also stated that the Watcher's family had been in charge of observing the home over the decades. But this was odd to Andrea because she claimed that she and her husband had never received anything like this in their 23 years in the house. They threw the letter away without much thought. Derek and Maria Broaddus would request the Woods to come to the police station with them the next day to file a report. There, Detective Leonard Lugo told all of them not to tell anyone about the letters, including their new neighbors, most of whom they had not met yet, and all of whom were now suspects. As unsettling and as ominous as this letter was, it was, after all, just a letter. Nothing bad had actually happened to them yet. Maybe they could just chalk it up to some weird neighbor who was unhappy with the renovations they made, or some twisted teenager trying to spook the new family. While Derek and Maria were definitely on high alert after this incident, even going so far as to having Derek cancel a business trip out of town so that Maria and the kids wouldn't be left alone, they decided to move forward with their renovations, and their plans of moving in and home improvement projects continued. They kept working on the home, moving a lot of their belongings in and connecting with their new neighbors, all while keeping a close eye on their children, though, and staying hyper-aware of what was going on around them. One day they arrived to work on the house, only to find that a very heavy sign that had been hammered into the ground had been ripped out or pushed over. Was this an act of simple teen vandalism? Or was it the Watcher making their presence known? Another day, some neighbors stopped by the home to introduce themselves and take a tour of the renovation progress. Derek Broaddus would become alarmed when the woman would state to him, "It'll be nice to have some young blood in the neighborhood." Was this the Watcher? Days later, Maria Broaddus stopped over at the house to check out some paint samples and to check the mail when a familiar-looking piece of mail was once again nestled in the mailbox. Letter number 2 from the Watcher made it completely evident that this lurker had been watching the family more closely than ever now. The letter called everyone in the home by name, including their children. They referenced specific details about the Broaddus children, including their birth order, details of their activities, and even some remarks about some of the toys the kids had been playing with. The Watcher even knew the kids' nicknames. So while Maria waited for the police to arrive at the property, she read the newest words that the Watcher had for them.
Mr. and Mrs. Broaddus, welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload, careful of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. The house is crying from all the pain it is going through. You have changed it and made it so fancy. You are stealing its history. It cries for the past and what used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. The 1960s were a good time for 657 Boulevard when I ran from room to room imagining the life with the rich occupants there. The house was full of life and young blood. Then it got old, and so did my father, but he kept watching until the day he died. and now I watch and wait for the day when the young blood will be mine again. Have they found what is in the walls yet? In time they will. I am pleased to know your names now, and the name of the young blood you have brought to me. You certainly say their names often. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all of the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Will they sleep in the attic, or will you all sleep on the second floor? Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me to know who is in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the Watcher, and have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on and kindly sold it when I asked them to. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession. And now you are too, Broadus family. Welcome to the product of your greed. Greed is what brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard, and now it has brought you to me. Have a happy moving in day. You know I will be watching. The Watcher.
Who was the Watcher? Even more, what did the Watcher want from the Broadus family, and what evil plan was the stalker waiting to execute? Derek and Maria Broadus decided right then and there that all their worst fears were indeed not an overreaction, and that it was time to stop bringing their children around the home. Someone was obviously watching their every move and threatening to do them harm. Whether these were just hollow threats or something far more sinister, Derek and Maria had no intention of finding out. At this point, they weren't even sure if they still wanted to move into what they had hoped would be their dream home. Was it worth all the trouble? Were their lives in danger? That's a question they'd continue to ponder in the coming weeks, right before a third letter from the Watcher arrived.
657 Boulevard is turning on me. It is coming after me. I don't understand why. What spell did you cast on it? It used to be my friend, and now it is my enemy. I am in charge of 657 Boulevard. It is not in charge of me. I will fend off its bad things and wait for it to become good again. It will not punish me. I will rise again. I will be patient and wait for this to pass and for you to bring the young blood back to me. 657 Boulevard needs young blood. It needs you. Come back. Let the young blood play again like I once did. Let the young blood sleep in 657 Boulevard. Stop changing it and let it alone.
The Broadus family, as well as the previous homeowners John and Andrea Woods, together with police, began to formulate some possible ideas to explain the source of the letters. What they first wanted to determine was whether it could have been possibly someone in the neighborhood. The postmarks showed that they were sent locally, or at least within close proximity. The first letter was postmarked June 4th, which was before the sale of the house ever even went public because no for sale sign was ever posted in the yard. So whoever sent the first letter would have had to have a somewhat intimate knowledge of the fact that the house was even being sold in the first place. Additionally, John and Andrea Woods admitted to also getting a letter in the mail before they moved out of 657 Boulevard. So the person who sent their letter would have had to know about the sale as well. And it's a common occurrence for buyers there to get into bidding wars against each other, with homes frequently selling for far above appraised value. And 657 Boulevard was no exception to that. When the Broaddus family purchased their home from the Woodses, they weren't the only potential buyers interested in it. So was the Watcher someone who had also had hopes of making the home theirs, and in an effort to get into the home, attempted to drive the Broaddus family out with fear and intimidation? The possibility was looked into, but other families who had made offers on the home seemed to have alibis and explanations, and it just didn't seem like a realistic possibility. The competing buyers seemed to have no ill will regarding the home, and they weren't likely the senders of the letters. But it was driving Derek and Maria Broaddus to the brink of insanity, and not knowing who was watching every move they made. They continued to half-heartedly make an attempt to meet their new neighbors. They attended neighborhood barbecues and summer soirees, all while not being able to share with anyone that someone was secretly making their lives a living hell. Police had instructed them not to tell anybody and to act perfectly normal, which was difficult because the Watcher consumed their thoughts all day long. Derek and Maria recalled attending a neighborhood party with their children and not letting the kids out of their sight even for a moment, yelling their kids' names if they wandered off more than a few feet. It was at this party that Derek Broaddus gained some insight into one of the eccentric families on the block. In a conversation with John Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down from Derek and Maria, he told Derek about the Langford family. The Langfords lived right in between the Broadduses and the Schmidts, and they were known to be strange, but harmless. Peggy Langford, who was in her 90s, lived in the home with several of her adult children, all of whom were in their 60s. The strangest one of the bunch was Michael, the son who was described as having a beard like Ernest Hemingway. Police brought Michael Langford down for questioning. They said that Langford's speech pattern actually matched the style that the letters were written in. It seemed to be more than just a coincidence, but they also said that absolutely nothing could be done. There was no crime here. Nobody had actually done anything. Yet. Police stated that it would probably all be okay, but Derek Broaddus was not okay with probably, and he was on a mission to find the Watcher. He installed cameras everywhere in and outside of the home, and he spent night after night crouched behind windows in the dark in an attempt to spot anyone lurking in the shadows, but he found nothing. Derek had papers, photos, maps, legal documents spread all over the house. He made charts for himself showing which houses were within earshot of theirs, and of names of all the homeowners and when the homeowners had moved into their homes. Derek feared that his wife Maria was starting to think he had lost his mind. The Broaddus family enlisted the help of private investigators, the FBI, private security consultants, and numerous others with experience in solving crimes and profiling criminals. They finally determined a possible profile of who the Watcher might be. Those details included someone older given the style and certain words that were chosen in the letters. Also, someone who may have been an avid reader based on their vocabulary and the dramatic style of their writing. They also determined it was probably someone who wasn't very masculine. They thought the person may have somewhat impulsive and erratic behavior, and that they had a lot of anger directed towards wealthy people. These possible personality traits, though, did not bring them any closer to a suspect. While the strange neighbor, Michael Langford, seemed like a potential fit for the Watcher, there was no real evidence pointing directly at him or giving them an opportunity to make an arrest. Langford had diagnosed yet controlled schizophrenia, and all the people that knew him would say it made him occasionally do a few things that people would call odd, but that he had a very kind heart and he was not a threat to anyone. While they kept their focus mainly on the eccentric Langford family, there were other people that they should have been looking into. There were multiple sex offenders in the neighborhood, and there were some other neighbors who lived behind 657 Boulevard who seemed to keep a suspiciously close eye on the Broaddus home. Every new possible suspect led nowhere, and the Broaddus family grew increasingly disheartened, paranoid and anxious about the thought of moving into their new home. They looked into getting watchdogs, they installed security alarms, and they enlisted in the help of part-time security guards. Running out of ideas, they even had a priest come bless the home. Shockingly, there were several instances of the alarm system going off in the middle of the night, but no perpetrator was ever apprehended. It became a situation where moving into their dream home had become a complete nightmare. They spent $1.4 million on this house plus the cost of renovations. But what price were they ultimately willing to pay for their dream home? Finally, they got lawyers involved. They had lawyers communicating with the Langford family, who also had lawyers, and they had lawyers communicating with John and Andrea Woods, who sold them the house, and that ended up in a lawsuit between the two families. Derek and Maria Broaddus sued John and Andrea Woods for not disclosing the letter they'd received from the watcher prior to the closing. They stated that the Woods family knowingly withheld information from them that the house had a stalker. But the Woods family maintained that in over 2 decades of living at 657 Boulevard, nothing like this had ever happened before. They regarded the letter as more strange than threatening, adding that they never felt watched and they rarely even locked their doors at night. At this point, the Broaddus family made the decision not to move into the house that had caused so much turmoil in their lives. They put the house back on the market, but rumors swirled, as they do, and the seemingly cursed house sat on the market with no interested buyers. The media caught wind of this story, and it went viral. The Broaddus family began receiving hundreds of media requests. Morning shows and entertainment news sources ran short pieces featuring the Broaddus' story. Entire subreddits were formed to discuss theories on this case, and everyone had their own opinions about who the watcher was. The townspeople of Westfield panicked after the story went viral. People were frightened and baffled by this incredible mystery. Now it wasn't just the Broaddus family who had distrust in all their neighbors, but everyone in the Westfield community shared the same paranoia. Things would take a surprising turn when police announced to the Broadduses that they obtained DNA from the envelopes. The DNA was female. Immediately, investigators obtained DNA samples from all the females in the Langdon family next door, but none of them were a match. Ultimately, police officers denounced anyone in the Langford family as having anything to do with the Watcher letters. Now the mystery would deepen. Who was the Watcher? With no leads, detectives would go back and request a DNA sample from Andrea Woods, the previous homeowner of 657 Boulevard, and they would also question the Woods' son. Again, this would lead to nothing. One night while they were staking out the property, a car drove up to 657 Boulevard and sat there for quite a while. Police questioned the owner of the car, a woman who would tell them that she thought her boyfriend could have perhaps had something to do with the letters. Especially noteworthy was the fact that he was a gamer. In one of the video games he played, he named his avatar the Watcher. Police attempted to contact the boyfriend, who was actually a previous resident of a home on the boulevard. But in a frustrating turn of events, the young man would never show up for questioning, and police would say they didn't have enough evidence to pursue anything with him. Another promising lead would pop up when someone else in Westfield came forward stating that right around the time when Derek and Maria received their first note from the Watcher, they also received a note from the Watcher. They found it strange, but not threatening. Since this was before anything had ever come out in the news yet, they threw the letter away and gave it no further thoughts. police began formulating an idea that maybe there were no leads because nobody else in the public sector was involved. Maybe the Broadduses themselves made up the entire story. They theorized that Derek and Maria sent the letters to themselves and orchestrated the events. But why would they do that? Some people suspected that after closing on the $1.4 million fixer-upper, Derek and Maria got buyer's remorse. Maybe they wanted or needed out. But if that were the case, why would they spend so much time, money, and energy on home surveillance, private investigators, and lost wages, especially knowing that the trail may very well lead right back to them if they were lying? Some would speculate that the Broaddus family had big dreams of creating so much hype around the Watcher letters that the story had been made up in an effort to get a book deal or maybe a movie deal out of it. Or maybe they were planning an insurance fraud scheme. Everyone in town seemed to have a theory, but most of them were very far-fetched and quickly debunked. Investigators all agreed the Broaddus family had nothing to do with the Watcher letters, but the community still seemed to turn on the Broaddus family. Rumors were spread. Animosity from townspeople grew as they worried about their property values. They started resenting the Broaddus family for claiming that the community they all loved might not be as safe as they all thought it was. Other kids began picking on the Broaddus children, and the whole town turned against them. The community that Maria Broaddus had grown up in, where her parents lived and where she wanted to raise her own children, was not as welcoming as it once was. Years would go by, and in 2017, the Broaddus family would still be paying their exorbitant mortgage on their empty dream home, while also renting a second home in which they felt safer. They continued to battle the city council on their options, all while trying to sell the home that had turned into such a huge nightmare for them. The house sat empty for so long, 2.5 years to be exact, that squirrels moved into the attic. One day, as Derek Broaddus was working on some repairs in the empty home, he ran down to the mailbox to check for any bills that may have accumulated while they were away. Shockingly, there was another letter from the Watcher.
Violent winds and bitter cold to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria. You wonder who the Watcher is? Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the Watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. Good move. I walked by the news trucks when they took over my neighborhood and mocked me. I watched as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher. I will have revenge. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break.
What more could the Watcher take from them? The author had robbed the Broaddus family of years of happiness, stolen their dream home from them, and cost them their entire savings and destroyed their friendships. What was a house to Derek and Maria Broaddus at this point? They made it out alive, and that was all that mattered to them now. Eventually, Derek and Maria Broaddus would find a brave renter to rent the home, which helped soften the financial blow a bit, but it still didn't even cover the cost of the mortgage, taxes, and insurance. Then in 2019, 5 years after the first letter they received from the Watcher, the house would finally be purchased by a new set of owners. Derek and Maria Broaddus ended up taking a huge hit of nearly $500,000 just for the sake of getting rid of this house. They could finally be free of the Watcher's grip, but would they ever be the same? And who was the Watcher? To this day, we still don't know their identity or their motive. But in one final letter, the Watcher had a few dark words for Derek and Maria Broaddus before parting ways forever.
You are despised by the house, and the Watcher won.
I'm Kelly Behrens-Brink, and this has been tonight's True Crime Sleep Story. Thank you to my special guest, Miles Tridle of the Warning Woods podcast, for playing the part of the Watcher tonight. Please subscribe to his podcast and go follow him on social media. Now go lock your doors, sweet dreams, sleep tight, and don't let the Watcher bite. Good night, everyone. Hello and welcome to True Crime Sleep Stories, where you can settle in with a good true crime tale while drifting off into a safe, sleepy slumber. Maybe you want to sip on a hot cup of tea, grab a warm fleece blanket, or cozy up by the fire. Whatever you decide to do, just make sure you're comfortable and ready for relaxation. I'm your host, Kelly Behrens-Brink, and before we get started tonight, I want to remind you that as a Patreon member, you'll get even more sinister, sleepy content because you get multiple versions of each and every true crime story. Patrons will have access to an ad-free version so you can really relax without the distraction of advertisements, as well as a version with or without music. Some people enjoy the music and some people prefer it without, but patrons can have it all. You'll also have a video version, so there's a lot of value there in your membership, and you're supporting the show. You can go to patreon.com/truecrimesleepstories to sign up now. And now it's time to get comfy because I'm going to tell you a bedtime story. Since August 20th, 2007, at least 20 detached human feet have been found on the coasts of the Salish Sea in British Columbia, Canada, and beaches in Washington State and the US. These macabre discoveries have sparked a lot of interest among scientists and conspiracy theorists alike. Why would so many feet be lost in this unusual way? How did they get there? What happened to the rest of the bodies? The feet were usually found in shoes, which experts thought were responsible for both keeping the feet buoyant enough to eventually wash to shore and for giving the feet enough protection from decomposition to be found relatively intact. The most recent discovery was on January 1st, 2019, when people on Jetty Island in Everett, Washington called police to report a boot with a human foot inside, which medical examiners were able to match to a man named Antonio Neal, who had been missing since December 12, 2016. The 22-year-old man, who was very close to his family, went missing without a trace less than 2 weeks before Christmas 2016, never to be seen or heard from again. 2 painful years would go by with no answers until Antonio's boot, faded from salt water and sun, would wash up onto a Washington beach with part of his leg and his sock still in it. Other than news that Antonio had been in an altercation with an unknown man the night prior to going missing, there have been no leads in Antonio Neal's still unsolved case. And his mystery is not the only one like it. These foot discoveries are not the first ones on British Columbia's coast. Prior to the recent seeming rush of feet washing ashore, there have been earlier instances going back more than a century, such as a leg in a boot that was found on a Vancouver beach over 100 years prior to Antonio Neal's case, all the way back in 1887. Then, on July 30th, 1914, the Vancouver Sun reported that recent arrivals from Kimsquit reported a human leg encased in a high boot that was found on a beach near the mouth of the Salmon. It was thought that the remains were from a man who had drowned on the river the previous summer. As of September 2018, 15 feet have been found in the Canadian province of British Columbia since 2007, and 5 in the U.S. state of Washington. The feet include a number of matched pairs. In British Columbia, 13 of the 15 feet have been identified. The latest was a left foot found on the shore of a rocky beach in West Vancouver, British Columbia, in September 2018, and through DNA analysis linked to a male that went missing earlier that year. The 2 identified feet found in February 2016 washed up on the shore of Botanical Beach on the west coast of Vancouver Island. In the U.S., one of these pairs belonged to a woman who jumped from a bridge. Of the 2 other U.S. feet identified, 1 foot belonged to a missing fisherman and the other of a depressed man who probably committed suicide. His identity has been withheld on request of his family. After the 5th foot was discovered of the 20, the story had begun to receive increased international media attention. With major headlines from newspapers such as the Melbourne Herald-Sun, the Guardian, and the Cape Times in South Africa, the story elicited much speculation about the cause of the mystery, originating from morbid fascination with this type of subject, as stated by one scientist who identifies remains of victims. As international interest in the mystery of the disembodied feet grew, even late-night talk show host David Letterman questioned 2 Canadian audience members about the mystery. Everyone wanted to know where the floating feet were coming from. Another human foot was discovered on June 18, 2008 on Vancouver Island. Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an investigation and found that this particular instance was a hoax. It was actually a skeletonized animal paw which was put in a sock and a shoe and then stuffed with dried seaweed. After the 11th foot was found on August 31st, 2011, in Vancouver, copycats began to surface with even more hoaxes. Several running shoes contained what police suspected as raw meat were found washed up on Oak Beach, British Columbia. In Canada, the coroner's service said in December 2017 that foul play had been ruled out by authorities in all investigations, and that the feet came from people who died either in accidents or by suicide, and the feet detached during the normal decomposition process. Decomposition may separate the foot from the body because the ankle is relatively weak, while buoyancy caused by air either inside or trapped within a shoe would allow it to float away. According to Simon Fraser University entomologist Gail Anderson, extremities such as the hands, feet, and head often detach as a body decomposes in water, but they rarely float. However, finding feet and not the rest of the bodies has been deemed unusual. Finding 2 feet has been guessed at 1 in a million odds, and thus has been referred to as an anomaly by one police officer. There's so much more to this story, and if you're still awake and interested, I highly recommend you Google this, or check out our show notes for more resources on the mystery of the severed feet. I'm Kelly Behrens-Brink, and this has been tonight's True Crime Sleep Story. Lock your doors, sweet dreams, sleep tight, and don't let the monsters bite. Good night. Hello and welcome to True Crime Sleep Stories, where you can settle in with a good true crime tale while drifting off into a safe, sleepy slumber. Maybe you want to sip on a hot cup of tea, grab a warm fleece blanket, or cozy up by the fire. Whatever you decide to do, just make sure you're comfortable and ready for relaxation. I'm your host, Kelly Behrens-Brink, and before we get started tonight, I want to remind you that as a Patreon member, you'll get even more sinister, sleepy content because you get multiple versions of each and every true crime story. Patrons will have access to an ad-free version so you can really relax without the distraction of advertisements, as well as a version with or without music. Some people enjoy the music and some people prefer it without, but patrons can have it all. You'll also have a video version, so there's a lot of value there in your membership, and you're supporting the show. You can go to patreon.com/truecrimesleepstories to sign up now. And now it's time to get comfy because I'm going to tell you a bedtime story. The Hinterkaifeck murders occurred on the evening of March 31st, 1922, when 6 inhabitants of a small Bavarian farmstead located approximately 70 kilometers or 43 miles north of Munich, Germany, were murdered by an unknown assailant. The 6 victims were Andreas Gruber, age 63, Kazilia Gruber, age 72, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, age 35, Victoria's children, Kazilia, aged 7, and Joseph, aged 2, and the newest maid, Maria Baumgartner, age 44. They were all found struck dead. The perpetrator or perpetrators lived with the 6 corpses of their victims for 3 days. The murders are considered to be one of the most gruesome and puzzling unsolved crimes in German history. 4 of the dead bodies were stacked up in the barn, the victims having been lured there one by one. Prior to the incident, the family and their previous maid reported hearing strange sounds coming from the attic, which led that maid to be so scared of the house that she quit her job and left. The case remains unsolved to this day. Strange things began to occur in and around Hinterkaifeck sometime shortly before the attack. 6 months prior to the attack, the family maid had quit. It had been widely claimed that her reason for leaving was that she heard strange sounds in the attic and believed that the house was haunted. Andreas Gruber found a strange newspaper from Munich on the property in March of 1922. He couldn't remember buying it and initially believed that the postman had lost the newspaper. That was not the case, however, as no one in the vicinity subscribed to that paper. Just days before the murders, Gruber told neighbors he discovered tracks in the fresh snow that led from the forest to a broken door in the farm's machine room. The tracks led in, but there were no tracks leading out. Was someone hiding and waiting for them? Later during the night, they heard footsteps in the attic, but Gruber found no one when he searched the building. Although he told several people about these alleged observations, he refused to accept help, and the details went unreported to the police. According to a school friend of the 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel, the young girl reported that her mother, Victoria, had fled the farm the night before the act after a violent quarrel, and only hours later had been found in the forest. On the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, a Friday, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the farm. Maria's sister had escorted her there and left the farm after a short stay. She most likely was the last person to see the family alive. It appears that in the late evening, Victoria Gabriel, her 7-year-old daughter Cecilia, and her parents Andreas and Cecilia were lured to the family barn through the stable, where they were murdered one at a time. The perpetrator or perpetrators used a mattock, which is a tool similar to a pickaxe used for digging and chopping, belonging to the family farm, and killed the family with blows to the head. The perpetrator then moved into the living quarters where, with the same murder weapon, he killed baby Joseph sleeping in his bassinet and the family's maid in her bedchamber. 4 days passed between the murders and the discovery of the bodies. On April 1st, coffee sellers Hans Scharovsky and Edward Scharovsky arrived in Hinterkaifeck to take an order. When no one responded to the knocks on the door and the window, they walked around the yard, but they found no one. They only noticed that the gate to the machine house was open before they decided to leave. Cecilia Gabriel was absent without excuse for the next few days of school, and the family failed to show up for Sunday worship, which was not like them. Assembler Albert Hoffner went to Hinterkaifeck on April 4th to repair the engine of the food chopper there. He stated that he had not seen any of the family and had heard nothing but the sounds of farm animals and the dog inside the barn. Around 3:30 p.m., Lawrence Schlittenbauer sent his son Johann, 16, and stepson Joseph, 9, to Hinterkaifeck to see if they could make contact with the family. When they reported that they had not seen anyone, Schlittenbauer headed to the farm the same day with Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel. Entering the barn, they found the bodies of Andreas Gruber and his wife Cecilia Gruber, his daughter Victoria Gabriel, and his granddaughter Cecilia murdered in the barn. Shortly after that, they found the chambermaid Maria Baumgartner and the youngest family member, Victoria's son, Joseph, murdered in the home. Initial investigations began, but they were hampered by the number of people who had interacted with the crime scene, moved bodies and items around, and even cooked and eaten meals in the kitchen. The day after the discovery of the bodies, a court physician performed the autopsies in the barn. It was established that a mattock was most likely the murder weapon, though the weapon itself was not found at the scene. Evidence showed that the younger girl, Cecilia, had been alive for several hours after the assault. She had torn her hair out in tufts while lying in the straw. The skulls of the victims were removed and sent to Munich, where they were further examined. The police first suspected the motive to be robbery, and they interrogated traveling craftsman vagrants, and several inhabitants from the surrounding villages. But when a large amount of money was found still in the house, they abandoned that theory. It was clear that the perpetrator had remained at the farm for several days after the murder. Someone had fed the cattle, eaten the entire supply of bread from the kitchen, and had recently cut meat from the pantry. With no clear motive to be gleaned from the crime scene, the police began to formulate a list of suspects. Despite repeated arrests, no murderer has ever been found, and the files were closed in 1955. Nevertheless, the last interrogations took place in 1986, before criminal Hauptkommissar Konrad Müller retired. In the inspection record of the court commission, it was noted that the victims were probably drawn to the barn by restlessness in the stable and noises from the animals. A later recreation attempt, however, revealed that at least human screams from the barn could not be heard in the living area of the main house. On the night after the crime, 3 days before the bodies were discovered, the artisan Michael Plokel happened to pass by Hinterkaifeck. Plokel observed that the oven had been heated by someone in the house. That person had approached him with a lantern and blinded him, whereupon he hastily continued on his way. Plokel also noticed that the smoke from the fireplace had a disgusting smell. This instance was not investigated, and there were no investigations conducted to determine what had been burned that night in the oven. On April 1st at 3 a.m., the farmer and butcher Simon Reiblander, on the way home near Brunnen, saw 2 unknown figures at the edge of the forest. When the strangers saw him, they turned around so that their faces could not be seen. Later, when he heard of the murders in Hinterkaifeck, he thought it was possible that the strangers might have been involved. In the middle of May 1927, a stranger was said to have stopped a resident of Weidhofen at midnight. He asked him questions about the murder and then shouted that he was the murderer before he ran into the woods. The stranger was never identified. The suspect list over the years has been extensive. There have been at least a dozen suspects who were very seriously considered to have possibly been linked to these crimes. All of these suspects have interesting and mysterious motives. The first suspect was the presumably deceased husband of Victoria Gabriel, Karl Gabriel. He had reportedly been killed in Arras, France by a shell attack in December 1914 during the First World War. However, his body had never been recovered. After the murders, people began to speculate on whether he had indeed died in the war. Victoria Gabriel had given birth to Joseph in her husband's absence. 2-year-old Joseph was rumored to be the son of Victoria and her father, Andreas, who had an incestuous relationship that was documented in court and known in the village. He was raping his daughter, and the town convicted both of them of incest. After the end of the Second World War, war captives from the Schrobenhausen region, who were released prematurely from Soviet captivity, claimed that they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet officer who claimed to be the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. Some of these men later revised their statements, however, which diminishes their credibility. Many theorized that this Soviet might have been Karl Gabriel, because those who claimed to have seen the man after his reported death testified that Gabriel had wanted to go to Russia. This has never been proven. The next unusual suspect was a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Shortly after the death of his first wife in 1918, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was believed to have had a romantic relationship with Victoria Gabriel. He too was thought to have possibly been the father of baby Joseph. Schlittenbauer came under suspicion by locals early in the investigation because of his several suspicious actions immediately after the discovery of the bodies. When Schlittenbauer and his friends arrived to investigate, they had to break a gate to enter the barn because all of the doors were locked. However, immediately after finding the 4 bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer apparently unlocked the front door with a key and suspiciously entered the house alone. A key to the house had gone missing several days before the murders. Though it's possible that Schlittenbauer, as a neighbor or Victoria's potential lover, might have been given a key. When asked by his companions why he had gone into the house alone when it was unclear if the murderer might still be there, Schlittenbauer allegedly stated that he went to look for his son, Joseph. Regardless of the rumor, it's known that Schlittenbauer had disturbed the bodies at the scene, thus potentially compromising the investigation. For many years, local suspicion remained on Schlittenbauer because of his strange comments, which are seen as indicating knowledge of details that only the killer could recall. According to his information in the files for the case, local teacher Hans Blogger discovered Schlittenbauer visiting the remains of the demolished Hinterkaifeck in 1925. Upon being asked why he was there, Schlittenbauer stated that the perpetrator's attempt to bury the family's remains in the barn had been hindered by the frozen ground. This was seen as evidence that Schlittenbauer had intimate knowledge of the conditions of the ground at the time of the murders, although being a neighbor and familiar with the local land, he may have been making an educated guess. Another speculation was that Schlittenbauer murdered the family after Victoria demanded financial support for young Joseph. Before his death in 1941, Schlittenbauer conducted and won several civil claims for slander against people who described him as the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. Author Bill James, in his book The Man from the Train, alleges that a man known as Paul Mueller may have been responsible for the murders. Mueller was the only suspect in the 1897 murder of a Massachusetts family, and James believes Mueller killed dozens of victims based on research in American newspaper archives. The Hinterkaifeck murders bear some similarities to Mueller's suspected crimes in the United States, including the slaughter of an entire family located in their isolated Villisca, Iowa home, using the blunt edge of an axe, also with the apparent absence of robbery as a motive. James suspects that Mueller, described as a German immigrant in contemporary media, might have departed the U.S. for his homeland after private investigators and journalists began to notice and publicize patterns in family murders across state lines following the brazen 1912 murder of 2 families in a single night in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and similar family murders weeks afterwards, a few hundred miles away in neighboring Kansas and then Iowa. In the last chapter of The Man from the Train, authors Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James briefly discuss the murders at Hinterkaifeck. The authors explain the possibility that the German crimes might have been committed by Paul Mueller, the serial killer that the authors believe killed several families in the U.S. under similar circumstances between 1898 and 1912. The murders attributed to Mueller, including the Villisca axe murder, were apparently random nighttime home invasions in or near small railroad towns that left entire families bludgeoned to death with the blunt end of an axe, and were probably motivated by a sadistic and necrophilic attraction to prepubescent girls. The authors rate the chances of Mueller as the Hinterkaifeck killer as more or less a toss-up, but they conclude that there's no real reason to believe that it's not him. But these are just a few of the suspects. There are many more, and although the Hinterkaifeck murders have never been solved, the legacy lives on in literature and on film in the form of books, articles, case studies, documentaries, and podcasts. I'm Kelly Behrens-Brink, and this has been tonight's True Crime Sleep Story. Lock your doors, sweet dreams, sleep tight, and don't let the monsters bite. Good night. Hello and welcome to True Crime Sleep Stories, where you can settle in with a good true crime tale while drifting off into a safe and sleepy slumber. Maybe you want to sip on a cup of hot tea, grab a warm fleece blanket, or cozy up by the fire. Whatever you decide to do, just make sure you're comfortable and ready for relaxation. I'm your host, Kelly Behrens-Brink, and before we get started tonight, I want to remind you that as a Patreon member, you'll get even more sinister, sleepy content because you get multiple versions of each and every true crime sleep story. Patrons will have access to an ad-free version so you can really relax without the distraction of advertisements, as well as a version with and without music. Some people really enjoy the music and some people prefer it without, but patrons can have it all. You'll also have a video version, so there's a lot of content there in your membership and you're supporting the show. You can go to patreon.com/truecrimesleepstories to sign up. And now it's time to get comfy because I'm going to tell you a bedtime story. Many small towns seem to just disappear as time goes on, and Iowa is no stranger to fading farm communities. Without some form of industry or reason that brings tourists or unexpected passers-by through the town, they almost seem to just fall off the map. Van Cleve, Iowa exists today, although barely, because of two reasons: agriculture and the railroad that once ran close to it. The town of Van Cleve was founded in the 1800s and it reached a peak population of 107 people in 1902. At that time, it was a stop on a railroad track that ran from Newburgh, Iowa to State Center, Iowa. However, the beginning of the end occurred in 1925 when that stretch of railroad was abandoned. And it's probably only the horrible events that occurred on June 5th, 1910 that will keep this unincorporated community in our history books. It was on that night that the brutal murder of 3 members of the Hardy family took place. A suspect was never officially charged in the murder, not that there aren't people in question, but this murder will most likely never get solved. So James, age 63, and his wife Mary, 57, along with their children Earl, who was 29, and Ray, who was 19, lived on a rented farm about 4.5 miles south of Van Cleve, Iowa. They moved to that farm in 1901 from Mound Prairie Township in Jasper County, Iowa. 29-year-old Earl was described as handicapped, but he was able to participate in some tasks on the farm. His brother Ray was a strong and rugged young man and often did more than his fair share of the farm chores. This family was known for getting along very well, and they shared the farm work as best as they could. They were well respected in the community for their hard work and for their ability to overcome the challenges that they faced at that time with a disabled child. In 1909, the family hired 2 neighbors who lived about 4 miles away from them. Mabel, 23, and her younger brother Chester, who was only 11, to help with the housework and the farm chores. Raymond Hardy noticed the family's new female helper, and these two took a liking to one another, and they were soon spending large amounts of time together. And with all that time they spent together, Mabel would soon become pregnant, and the two planned to marry on June 8th, 1910 in Newton, Iowa. As the wedding approached, Mabel moved back into her parents' farm to prepare for the event. On the morning of Sunday, June 5th, 1910, James and Ray were heading out to the barn where they discovered that one of their horses, Old Kit, was bridled, and saddled and appeared ready to be taken somewhere. However, nobody in the family had done this. Obviously, this was a cause for concern, and horse thieves were common in those days. Ray and James decided that they should stay up that night watching over the farm in hopes of catching the perpetrator. After supper that night, Ray went to visit Mabel at her home, where he told her about what he and James had discovered that morning. He stayed until sometime after midnight, and then he headed back home to help his father watch over the horses. Ray arrived back home around 1 a.m. and supposedly entered the 2-story house via the west porch and went through the parlor into the dining room and struck a match to give himself some light. What he discovered was a horrifying scene. The light from the flame revealed his mother slumped over, half on and half off the sofa, with blood soaking the fabric and pooling on the floor. Obviously taken aback by the shock of his discovery, he moved backwards towards the kitchen. His match would shed light on the north side of the home, where he found Earl on the floor next to the milk buckets he had been carrying back from the barn. Earl had also been bludgeoned to death in the head, and blood covered the walls and the floor. Raymond told authorities that he immediately went to the family telephone and sounded the general ring, which alerts every patron on the line to an emergency. First to respond was a neighbor of the Hardys named C.W. Preston, who lived 2 miles to the southwest. Estimates of his arrival time are around or shortly before 1:30 a.m. Raymond had called the county sheriff, A.A. Nicholson, who lived in Marshalltown, Iowa, 14 miles north of Van Cleve, and he arrived on the scene at around 4 a.m. with Deputy C.B. Newson. Between 1:30 a.m. and 4 a.m., other neighbors had shown up and discovered James in the barn, where he had also been beat to death with a 30-inch long leaded gas pipe. The gas pipe was discarded near James' body, which may indicate that he was the last to die in the event. The gas pipe had been sharpened on one end because it had been used to pry frozen manure off the ground. All 3 victims had been struck from behind on the right side of their heads. Allegedly, a bloody handprint was left on the wallpaper above the couch that Mary was killed on. The handprint faced down towards the floor. According to the Des Moines Daily News, the bloody couch was carried to the west side of the yard, and the 3 bodies were wrapped in white shrouds and placed on death cots side by side in the parlor. Neighbors and friends filed through the house all morning to look at the victims and gawk at the scene of the crime. Since Ray was the first on the scene and the first to report the gruesome incident, he was put under suspicion that he may have been the killer. It was determined that the killer was familiar with the layout of the barn and of the property. The sequence of events most likely happened before sunset at 8:45 p.m., as neither James nor Earl had any form of light with them while they were out doing evening chores. Mary was most likely killed first, followed by Earl, and then James. All of them were caught by surprise and beaten to death brutally. The murders were speculated to be planned and thought through very well, and that this was not a crime of passion as far as they could tell. And ironically, robbery was also ruled out, as the family was not wealthy and both James and Earl had money in their pockets. However, Ray was found with $35, which at the time would be about 6 weeks' worth of wages. That's a lot of money for a quote-unquote poor family at that time. Ray's overalls and hat were found hidden and both covered with blood, which he claimed was from butchering chickens earlier that week. There was a note found inside the house, but later was determined to be forged, and it was signed by someone claiming to be James and also Earl. The note stated that the 2 men were giving Ray $1,000. Ray said that this note was all written as a joke between them earlier in the week. But these details put Ray in the crosshairs of the investigation. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and Sheriff Nicholson took him into custody mid-morning on June 6th. As Raymond was questioned, he remained calm and composed. He displayed only grief at the loss of his family and never veered from his account of the night of the murder. He admitted to having very little money to start his life with Mabel after their wedding, but he remained firm in the fact that he did not kill his family. His explanations regarding the bloody clothing remained consistent as well. He explained that he hid his bloody clothing in fear that he'd be suspected of these heinous crimes. His story, however, gets sketchy when his hat, which he wore to visit Mabel, was found also with blood on it. He stated that he hung his hat over the couch where he found his mother, but there was no hook there for a hat to be hanging. He speculated that maybe he just placed it on the couch and that it possibly fell off and landed in the pool of blood on the floor. Later, it would be discovered that he was wearing a hat when he went to see Mabel. Mabel testified that the hat had no blood on it when he was there visiting her, but when authorities found the hat later, it had blood on it. Ray would say that he took the hat off near his mother when he found her body and that it must have fallen into the blood pool. Sheriff Nicholson maintained that he had a case against Raymond. However, his version of motive changed several times. First, it was because the families had opposed the marriage of Ray and Mabel. However, the families were known to be relatively close, and Mabel testified that Mrs. Hardy never expressed opposition to their marriage and in fact promised half the family chickens to the two after they got married. The sheriff also asserted that Ray and his family often fought and argued over chores, but that wasn't true. Everyone in town would attest to the fact that they got along very well. Sheriff Nicholson also accused Raymond of killing his family to inherit the family's possessions, including livestock, machinery, household goods, and things like that would be necessary for starting his family with Mabel in a home other than the Hardys' rented home that had just been the scene of a triple homicide. The following week on June 8th, the day that Ray and Mabel had planned to get married, they held a funeral instead for the Hardy family at their home. Raymond was in attendance, accompanied by Marshall County Sheriff's deputies. After the funeral, it was right back to jail for Ray, and he attempted suicide by hitting his head against the jail cell wall, but he was only able to break his nose. By this time, media in Iowa had all but placed the guilt on Raymond and proclaimed that evidence was mounting against the young man. But on June 10th, the coroner's jury ruled they were unable to find sufficient evidence to continue to hold Raymond Hardy, and therefore they released him. A main source of this lack of evidence was that the bloody handprint from the wallpaper provided insufficient ridge detail for fingerprints to be used. Within days, the crime scene had been scrubbed clean and the blood was washed off along with every bit of evidence that went along with it. About this time, news had spread to communities beyond Van Cleve, Iowa, and people had another story to tell. A man named Frank Wickersham from Luray, Iowa, reported that on the morning of June 6th, he was riding the train north towards Marshalltown, Iowa. Two men that nobody knew or spoke to climbed into the train. One had blood on his coat that several other passengers would corroborate. However, since nobody knew of the murders at that time the night before, there was no effort to apprehend or identify this man who proceeded north when Wickersham disembarked the train in Luray. Raymond had returned to the house, boxed up his belongings, and moved in with Mabel's family. Crops had already been planted, so he and Mabel's brother would tend to those. By the end of June, the reward for apprehension of the Hardy family murderer climbed to $885 through town donations. Since Ray was only 19, he wasn't legally able to marry Mabel. So L.J. Jason of Van Cleve stepped up to the plate and became Ray's legal guardian. So Raymond and Mabel finally married in Newton, Iowa in August 1910. On September 12th, the Hardy family possessions were auctioned off and brought a larger than usual sum of money due to the infamous nature of the crime. Neighbors pressed for a grand jury investigation of the murders, but officials deemed that would be a waste of money, as no new evidence had presented itself. Mabel and Ray Hardy welcomed their new baby boy in October 1910, and shortly after that, they moved to Minnesota, where they had 3 more children, Hazel, Myrtle, and Orville. Mabel's family followed them to Minnesota from Iowa. The family lived out the rest of their days farming in Minnesota, in Johnsonville Township near Lacone. Mabel Starnes Hardy passed away in 1951, and Ray passed away in May of 1969. The house where the murders took place, much like the Villisca axe murder house, is still standing and continues to be occupied. James, Mary, and Earl Hardy remain buried side by side in a cemetery in Colfax, Iowa. Their murders have never been solved. I'm Kelly Barons-Brink, and this has been tonight's True Crime Sleep Story. Good night, sleep tight, and don't let the monsters bite. Welcome to True Crime Sleep Stories. Are you ready for a sinister story? Because this one is a doozy. So lock your doors, turn on the fireplace, cuddle up, and cozy down. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of the diabolical Dolly Öesterreich and her secrets in the attic. August 22nd, 1922 seemed like a normal end to a late summer night. However, at the home of the Öesterreich family, it was anything but normal, and the day ended with neighbors hearing a gunshot followed by a scream. What was all the commotion, and who was in distress? Things like this don't happen in a small Wisconsin neighborhood, except sometimes they do. Before we get into today's story, I have a favor to ask. Have you subscribed to my YouTube channel yet? If not, go ahead and do that. By subscribing, you'll get access to lots of daily videos and true crime content, and we really appreciate your help in growing the show. Now, let's get into the story. Born in 1880, Walburga Korschel, also known as Dolly, was a German immigrant whose family settled in the rural Midwestern state of Wisconsin. At an early age, Dolly was hired to work at the textile factory owned by Fred Öesterreich. During Dolly's time at the textile mill, she was well known by her fellow coworkers. Dolly was an attractive young lady whom others doted on frequently. She was friendly and fun to be around, which attracted people to her. Dolly quickly caught the attention of Fred Öesterreich. Fred was a very wealthy man, but he was also known for his stubbornness and for being bullheaded. Fred was difficult to get along with and very set in his ways. Nevertheless, Dolly liked Fred, and the two married when Dolly was just 17 years old. Fred and Dolly's relationship appeared to be great on the outside until the unexpected death of their only child. This tragedy seemed to tear the two apart. Fred began to drink heavily and work extra long hours to ease his pain, and the marriage began to disintegrate. And while Fred turned to alcohol, Dolly turned to another vice: sex. Fred was an overworked husband who didn't have much time to take care of things around the house or to work on projects when those needed to be done. In the short amount of time when he was home, his time was spent drinking, and little attention was paid to Dolly and her needs. Dolly was a homemaker with a love of sewing. She was always on her sewing machine until one day it needed some repairs. And while the busy Fred was not able to fix it himself, he arranged for a repairman to come to the house to fix it. On Dolly's doorstep arrived a 17-year-old boy by the name of Otto Sanhuber. Otto had worked at the textile factory and was known to be pretty handy with sewing machines. The scandalous 33-year-old Dolly answered the door wearing a silk robe, tights, heavy perfume, and nothing else. This startled the teenage boy, but Otto nervously still entered the house and began making the needed repairs. You can imagine what happened between Dolly and Otto behind those closed doors that day, and this would be just the first of many of their romantic encounters. Dolly's marriage to Fred made her a very wealthy woman, but wealth alone did not bring Dolly satisfaction. She craved romance and attention. She had a strong sexual appetite that was not being fulfilled by her husband. So Dolly and Otto would meet frequently in the Öesterreich's home, as well as Otto's boarding house and nearby motels. The continual appearance of Otto at the Öesterreich's home had gained attention of the townspeople, especially the neighbors, who eventually notified Mr. Öesterreich. Dolly would always explain to others that Otto was just her vagabond brother who was staying with the family for a while. But there's one thing about small towns: people like to talk. Dolly knew she had to come up with a good story as to why the neighbors kept seeing this teenage boy constantly at their house, because obviously they were skeptical about Otto being her vagabond brother. When Fred approached Dolly with his suspicions, the quick-witted Dolly told Fred that the boy in question was someone trying to sell her something, and that he just kept coming back. She told Fred that she believed she had the problem resolved and that he would no longer be returning to the house. But now, Dolly knew she had to quickly think of a solution to prevent the townspeople from continuing to gossip about her interactions with Otto, while still being able to find a way to keep Otto in her life. Her clever plan was to hide Otto in the attic. To her, this seemed like a brilliant idea, and as crazy as it may sound to us, she was kind of right. Otto didn't have many friends, and he was not close to his family, so it wouldn't attract a lot of attention if he just went missing. So while Fred was away, Dolly and Otto would play. Dolly's libido kept her and Otto very busy. She and Otto would meet nearly 8 times a day. For 5 years, Otto would quietly live in the Österreich's attic of their Wisconsin home, only coming down to service Dolly while Fred was gone. When he was in the attic, he would silently read and also enjoy writing pulp fiction stories. Dolly furnished the attic with items for Otto to stay comfortable while he was up there. There were a few occasions that Fred had almost caught the two in the act, but for the most part, he was oblivious to the fact that there was a young man living in the attic. Anytime a noise was made or a shadow passed, Dolly would comfort Fred by stating, "You're just working too hard, and it's causing you to see and hear things." Regardless of how well they had been keeping their sexual affair a secret, it was only a matter of time before a wrench was thrown into their routine. In 1918, Fred decided it was time to move, and the place he settled on was Lafayette Park Place in Los Angeles, California, a very long way from Wisconsin. Dolly was not thrilled about the move, but she agreed as long as she could select their new residence herself. The purpose of the move was to allow the couple a fresh start and to give Fred the opportunity to launch a new company in the area. Dolly made her new home demands very clear, and one of the items that was a must in the new home was an attic. After several searches, Dolly finally found a home that had an attic, and that was not an easy feat. In hopes of continuing her affair with Otto, Dolly hatched a plan to have Otto move into the house before Fred and Dolly arrived. For 4 more years, Otto would spend his days living in the Österreich's attic and having sex with Dolly multiple times a day. That is, until August 22nd, 1922. On this night, Dolly and husband Fred had a terrible fight, one that Otto could hear loud and clear from his perch in the attic. It was so loud, in fact, that Otto thought Dolly might be in danger. He immediately dropped down from the attic and appeared with 2 guns. Right away, Fred recognized Otto as a previous employee of his from the textile factory, and the two went into a fighting rage. They tussled for quite a while until suddenly shots went off and Fred was hit 3 times. Sadly, Fred instantly passed away from the gunshot wounds. Otto thought fast and came up with a scheme to disguise what really happened. He ordered Dolly into the closet and proceeded to lock the door behind her. Otto took the closet keys and the guns with him to the attic. Neighbors surely would have heard the shots fire, and the police would be arriving in no time. The 2 lovers thought it would be very difficult to prove that Dolly could be responsible for Fred's death if she was locked in the closet. When police arrived on the scene, they were alerted to screaming coming from the closet. The police officers came to Dolly's rescue, but soon the questions started as to what happened. Dolly started to tell her story of the events that occurred that night. She told police that there was a robbery in the house. She said that the robbers shot Fred, stole several expensive items, including a posh diamond watch. Dolly claimed that the robbers then locked her in the closet and made their escape. The police were, of course, skeptical of Dolly's story, but they couldn't explain how she would be able to lock herself in the closet. That part of the story did not add up, But of course, they didn't know that there was another accomplice living up in the attic. Even though they were skeptical, they did not press any charges against Dolly, and she was released. After Fred's murder, Dolly took up residence in a new home with a new attic. Her life would not have to be a secret any longer, and she would be able to have her young lover, Otto, live with her. But that is not what happened. Dolly was still not satisfied with a normal life with just one man. Dolly forced Otto back into the attic while bringing multiple lovers in and out of her new home. She did buy Otto a typewriter to keep in the attic with him so that he could continue writing his pulp fiction stories, and Otto stayed content with being Dolly's attic love slave. Not long after moving, though, Dolly started dating her defense attorney, Herman Shapiro. As she began to feel more comfortable around Herman, she let her guard down and let several comments slip that started to raise some red flags. Dolly began to show Herman quite a bit of affection, and she gifted him with many expensive items, one being a luxurious diamond watch. Herman immediately recognized the watch as belonging to Fred Öesterreich. After questioning Dolly about the watch and how she obtained it, Dolly explained that she had just found it under a seat cushion. She claimed she just didn't think this piece of information was important enough to notify police about, so she never mentioned it to anyone but Herman. But being a man of integrity, Herman gave the diamond watch to police. This information was leaked to the press, which triggered two other individuals to come forward. J.E. Farber, a neighbor of Dolly's, and Roy Klum, a lover of Dolly's, came forward stating that Dolly had provided each of them with pistols to dispose of quickly. These were the same caliber pistols that Fred was murdered with. The investigators and prosecuting attorneys believed there was a connection. Not only did they have the testimony of Mr. Farber and Mr. Klum, but they also had the diamond watch that Herman gave them. After presenting their evidence, it was enough to arrest Dolly for Fred's murder in 1923. Even though Dolly was arrested, police were still trying to explain the mystery of how she ended up locked in a closet. Since they were unable to do that, eventually she was released. The entire time Dolly was in jail, Otto was in the attic of the empty house, fending for himself. Feeling guilty, Dolly notified Herman that her vagabond brother was in her attic and begged that he checked on Otto and provide him with groceries. When Herman tapped on the ceiling to alert Otto to come down, Herman was shocked to see the state that Otto was in. It was in this moment that the truth would start to unravel. Otto had not really had a conversation with anyone, other than occasionally Dolly, in over 10 years, so he was ecstatic to have another person to communicate with. He informed Herman that he was Dolly's sex slave for 10 years and that he had been made to keep their arrangement quiet. Herman, upset at finding out about Dolly's adultery, insisted that Otto leave at once. Otto fled the state and moved to Canada. After Dolly's release, she and Herman moved in together and their relationship lasted 7 more years. But after it ended, Herman notified the police of what he knew regarding Fred's death. A second warrant was issued for Dolly, and she was arrested again, but this time it was for the conspiracy of Fred's murder. Otto was also brought back and charged. Otto became known as Batman after admitting to living in the Österreich's attic for an entire decade. He was found guilty of murder, but luckily for Otto, the statute of limitations had been exhausted, and he was able to walk out of the courtroom as a free man. Dolly was also charged, but there were some concerns with the evidence, which resulted in a hung jury. So she was also able to walk away scot-free. Otto seemed to live a very quiet life after this was all over. He changed his name to Walter Klein, and records show him passing away in 1948 at the age of 60. Dolly ended up remarrying and spending nearly 30 years with her final partner until her 1961 death at the age of 80. If you ever hear anything in the attic and your spouse is telling you you're crazy, I suggest you look for yourself. You never know what secrets might be hiding up there. A very special thank you to Jamie Hunsaker Gibbs for writing and submitting tonight's true crime sleep story. Until next time, good night, sleep tight, and don't let the monsters bite.